Alright, in this tutorial we are going to go over unwrapping, or a quick way I like to unwrap at a maximum effect. So at this point we are going to go ahead and start unwrapping. When I unwrap, I do like to remove the grid by hitting G on the keyboard, G for grid, and then at this point it allows me to freely roam without actually having a grid in my way and obstructing my view. Then at this point, just go ahead and select the model, hit Unwrap UVW, and it will automatically unwrap the model itself on how it thinks it should be unwrapped, which in this case is wrong. So we're going to go through and manually unwrap this model through the techniques. So since you have Unwrap UVW highlighted already, just go ahead and select the polygon option from your selection, and we're just going to go ahead and move through this relatively quickly. Since this has already selected this, we're just going to go ahead and select this face here, and then we're just going to actually quick planar map this. So right here is you have a little paper with a lightning bolt. It is going to change depending on which version of 3ds Max you are using, but it's relatively in the same spot. Just look for quick planar map. Go ahead and click that, and what it's going to do is take a snapshot and flatten this viewport. So this flat plane is basically how it's rendering out the flattening of a 3D model. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and go to the other side and do the same thing. So we're just going to move through relatively quickly and select these. If you are unsure that you have clicked on multiple faces, you can click F3 to kind of see if you've highlighted any other areas. F3 to bring back the faces, but of course also in more complex models, if you hit F3, you notice how the face will block out pretty much any other information that's behind it. So if you need to see what's behind it, go ahead and hit F2, and what it does is it hides the faces, but since we already have this selected, the seams are in the way. Normally these will highlight red, depending on what you're doing. So at this point, we're just going to go ahead and hit planar, bring back the actual viewport itself, and then we're just going to go ahead and get back to unwrapping. If you do have a technically could be flat section, it's just wrapped around, feel free to actually wrap that as well, because it is going to take a flat planar area when it's trying to flatten it. But when you see it in your UV editor, it's going to look very similar to this inside of your UV editor. Don't worry, just go ahead and do that already, and it's going to remove the seams and the corners and make your texture seamless for what you're actually trying to achieve. Then at that point, now we have these side sections which we want to go ahead and do. So we're just going to head, and we're going to leave the seams in the corners where 3ds Max has gave us the option for. The reason why is because we're going to want to try and break this up without sacrificing resolution. So go ahead and hit quick planar map on that as well, and then just kind of work around and do the same on the other side. Whoop, went a little too far. And then there we go. Whoop, fast select, which makes me question. And doesn't look like I selected anything else. And those are still selected. Okay, cool. So at that point, just quick planar map once again. And now we're going to select these. Whenever you're clicking multiple faces or multiple vertices or anything within 3ds Max, Control and then click is what would actually give you the option to select multiple faces, vertices, or edges. And then once we've done that, I felt like I clicked something else once again because I move really fast. All right, we didn't, so we're just going to go ahead and click planar, and then those will show up in there. Now here on the inset, on the inside of the face, we can go ahead, because since this is nice and flat, we can go ahead and do this in one foul piece. So at that point, since these have no vertices in the center, or I'm sorry, edges in the center, you can't cut this up or split this up in any kind of way really, unless we added in more polys, which is a no-no. Polys are sacred. Resolution is a little more bendable. So we're just going to go ahead and quick planar that, and then quick planar that, and at that point, I believe, did I get both of them? I think I did. I can't remember. But we'll just go ahead and go through and do this one as well. And just to be sure, it doesn't hurt to do it multiple times. Oh, come on, you. There we go. Oh, that's what I wanted. Oh, yeah, I didn't do this side. That's what it was. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and go back through and select those. And we're just hit quick planar map. And at that point, we have technically unwrapped this entire model, but we still have one more step to go. We have the UV editor. So you'll see in edit UVs, you'll have open UV editor. Go ahead and click that. And what it'll do is it will pop up your UV editor. And at this point, I like to remove the grid is because it's stressful on the eyes. And it's hard to see where your lines are. So here, it's very much like 3D modeling, just in a 2D viewport. I like to, before I do anything, I like to select everything and then go over here to Rescale Elements. What it's going to do is when you click Rescale Elements, it's going to rescale the elements to be the same size as they are inside of your 3D viewport. So the pixel resolution is going to be true once you rescale everything. So since we've done that, we'll just go back into the editor. And then at this point, like I was explaining earlier, this is the light panel. So you can notice that like everything is overlapping on top of itself, which is okay, because all you have to do is select the faces, and then just go to Tools, Relax, and then you want to relax by polygon angles, and then hit Relax. And what it's going to do is relax the faces, edges, and vertices into its proper constraints and iterations, amount, and stretch, so on and so forth, depending on how you want to relax it. But in this case, we just left the defaults and just hit Start Relax. At that point, it has flattened out the entire light for a nice, smooth, relaxed finish. If there was any kind of alteration, if like say it relaxed and it was at like an angle, you can go ahead and try and straighten it out, which you can use the angle snap toggle if you wanted to snap your angles accordingly, or you can go into a free roam mode like you normally would. But since these were pretty much perfectly flat, we're just going to leave it there. Okay, now at this point, we're just going to go ahead and separate each of the different faces that we have utilized. Oh, come on. There we go. Always space these away from each other. The reason why is because if any of these faces overlap on top of each other, whatever you texture those with is going to be copied over to those respective faces. And that is kind of a no-no because you want everything to kind of have its own personal texture. That's the whole point, right? So at this point, we're just going to separate everything away from itself. And then with these, we can actually go ahead and relax these as well, is because we have geometry that is kind of extruded out a little bit. Same thing, polygon angles, relax, stop, relax. And you notice that it's not completely flush, but it's given a little bit more data room for the edges that have been beveled on the side, as you can see here. So even though it's flat on the top, with the relax, it has kind of given this angular perspective on this, so you can add a little bit more detail and resolution to these faces. As long as you can see it from this perspective, this is quite all right. Especially if you're not trying to match or seam anything on these, you won't have to flatten these. And what I mean by flattening is if you're working on something that is seamless via materials or anything like that, to kind of save yourself a lot of rework or adjustments, you can actually select the entire face, or edges I should say, and then come up to your align horizontally to pivot. So at this point, everything that has been selected that is horizontal, just click it and it flattens it right out, which is great if you're trying to make sure everything is seamless. But since we don't have any faces above here, you don't have to worry about it. And of course, if you need to straighten out edges vertically as well, same thing, go ahead and align vertical and just hit it and it will line it to a perfect flat line. But that's not so much the case here. These have all been pretty much unwrapped pretty prime at this point. There's really not much to modify, if anything. So at this point, we're going to select all, and we're going to shrink it down, is because the goal is you want to make sure that everything fits inside of this box as much as possible. The more you fill up this box, the better the resolution will be on your textures. So at that point, we're actually going to move these a little bit somewhere else, is because we want to make sure that these are all full. If you're not sure if everything is still to scale, go ahead and rescale. They weren't. So at that point, we actually have a little bit more room and everything will be pixel correct. And then we'll just go ahead and shift this down a little bit. I like to leave just a little bit of a cushion on the sides. I mean, this is also personal preference. You can scale up just a little bit more and kind of shift her around a little bit. As long as you are not like directly on the line, you don't have to worry about pixel bleed. At this one, what I mean by pixel bleed is anything that touches the sides will instantly loop over to whatever is on the other side. So you get this weird stretching texture look, and it is not always desired unless you're trying to go for something of that kind of look. All right, so as I scaled everything is rescaled to be the same or pixel correct at this rate. This is going to be the one thing that you see the most of. So the resolution for this, it takes precedence over everything else. Since these are so small and we cannot really get a finite amount of detail into these anyway, we get to break the cardinal rule of scaling independently outside of what is actually required. So what I mean by that is you can actually scale these down, and of course try to leave a little bit of room for it. Not too much, as long as it fits within the actual area, which it's a little scotch off. And we'll just shrink it just a little bit more. Just a little bit, right about there. Okay, so with that, we're getting to break that rule just a little bit. We're going to shift that over. So we have a little bit of a cushion here, but they are still textured without having the looping over to the other side. And with those, we can just kind of jam in there. We can bring these up in here. If you don't cover up the entire area, it's not a big deal as long as everything that is high texture profile, then it's always a good thing to make sure those take up the most amount of space. And with those, we can actually just move those horizontally. It doesn't really matter because we have plenty of room to work with. And at this point, the packing sheet, which is this little square, this is what will be rendered out in your resolution. So you have your 256 by 256 resolution, because you're always going to work with your resolutions in numerical values of 2. So 256 by 256, 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, and 2048 by 2048, unless you're working in 4K resolution, which at that point you'll scale up to the 4K resolution, which is 4056, I believe. Yeah, that sounds right. Quick math. Okay, so at this point, we have pretty much packed our texture sheet, so we can just go ahead and close out of that. And to finalize the texture sheet, we are going to right-click, collapse all, and now this asset is now ready to be shipped off to our third-party texture and textured at that point.